Okay, I'm going to try to get through the civil rights movement as quick as I can. So I talked about Brown versus Board of Education. Of all the Supreme Court cases that our U.S. Supreme Court has heard, probably ranks top two, maybe top three most important cases ever heard. Okay, moving on, we're going to go to Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, a young woman, sits down on a bus, is told she has to move, refuses to do so, is arrested. Next thing you know, there's a bus boycott. Ends up lasting much, much longer than anyone in Montgomery would have thought. And next thing you know, the city of Montgomery has to do away with their rules because the African Americans aren't riding. If you've watched the video, where you watched the video and did the worksheet, it was a real reversal of fortune here because you had your wealthier whites living in Montgomery, and oftentimes their housekeepers were black. Well, if the housework wanted to get done, the white homeowners had to go and pick up their house cleaners, and they had to drive them. So it's almost like the black house workers were being chauffeured by the whites to and from work, which was kind of interesting. Hopefully, you picked that up in the video when you watched it. Um, King's philosophy was nonviolent passive resistance. This was not a philosophy that was original to him. He actually adopted it from Mahatma Gandhi, who used this same approach in India in terms of his protest of the caste system. Then you have the Little Rock Nine. Segregation in schools can no longer exist, and a court order in Little Rock, Arkansas said that they needed to allow this Arkansas or Little Rock Public Schools needed to allow black students to attend Little Rock High, and so you had 9 students that volunteered to do this, and there was a lot of protests that went on with this. The governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, actually sent in the National Guard to keep the African American students from going there. Dwight D. Eisenhower said, "Okay, Faubus, you're going to send in the National Guard. I'm going to send in the real Army," and he called in the 101st Airborne. And the 101st Airborne escorted these 9 students to Little Rock High, and they had to stay with them for the remainder of the school year because these students were constantly being subjected to harassment of all different kinds. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 is passed. It protects the right to vote. It's not that blacks didn't have the right to vote in the South. It's just that whites were doing everything within their ability to keep them from voting. And we can talk about, we'll talk about later on some of the things that whites did. SNCC, the Students Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they started to have what were called sit-ins, and oftentimes what they would do is they would go to like a lunch counter in a restaurant, and whites would sit down with blacks, and they would sit down in the black section only. And they started this in the northern cities. You're not going to go down into the deep South and do this. I mean, you're going to get beat up and maybe even hung if you try to do this in the deep South. So they started this in the North, and it started okay. They some resistance, but not a great deal of resistance, and then gradually they started to spread a little bit southward. And then you had the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders were individuals who were riding buses, blacks, whites, oftentimes clergy, riding buses down into the South, because in the South, bus stations were segregated, and a bus station was kind of like a hub of activity in some of your smaller towns. People get off the bus and they get off at the bus station, and there's a lunch counter. They can go in, they can grab a bite to eat, they can use the bathroom, they can get something to drink. people are boarding the buses, people are getting off the buses because that's their destination, so they have to get luggage off, they have to put luggage on. It's kind of like a short layover at an airport. Um, and but again, the stations themselves were segregated, which violated interstate travel laws, because if a bus is going from one state to another, if it's going from a northern state where nothing like this occurs and it goes to a southern state, well, it can't occur in the southern states either. And so Freedom Riders went to the South. They protested. They met up with a great deal of violence, as is indicated on this picture of this Greyhound bus. James Meredith, really don't have time to talk a lot about James Meredith. MLJK, or MLKJ, sorry about that, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King was very selective as to marches that he would attend. He could not attend every march that he was requested to go to. He's only one man, and sometimes he might have representatives go, and then people would get very upset that King wouldn't show up. But King was very meticulous with what he was doing, and when he would go to marches, if it was one that he knew was going to have a lot of attention, he would go to it, and oftentimes these marches ended up in violence. Eventually, the media starts to cover these. Word, or not just word, but people are watching on the news as this violence unfolds, and people from around the country could not believe the violence that these peaceful protests are being subjected to. But the thing is, in the South, they don't care. And that's the thing you have to realize. It's almost back during this time period, during the Civil Rights Movement, driving down into the southern part of the United States, into states like Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia. It's almost like if you were in Europe driving from non-communist part of Europe to communist Europe. Even though there may not be signs up saying, you're driving into the part of the South that is completely racist, you just got the feeling where you were, because you didn't see people of different races intermixing. You went to a store and it was either occupied by people that were all black or people that were all white. There just wasn't a mixing of races. And just the whole attitude that you had, the way people talked, whites talked openly about blacks. They used, racial language like it was just commonplace, and they didn't care at all. And it was just not a nice place. And so, knowing this, King, knew that these marches were going to turn violent. And the thing you have to realize is, if you're going to have a march like this, you have to apply for an application. You just don't say, have a bunch of people gather around and say, okay, we're going to start marching down the street. You have to apply for this. First Amendment allows for freedom of assembly. So you can assemble, but you can't cause disruptions. And so you have to go and you have to apply for applications to do something like this. And so everyone knew well in advance when these marches were going to take place. And oftentimes, and law enforcement knew oftentimes they would have to provide protection, but they were the ones oftentimes who were incurring the violent acts. Eventually, when LBJ becomes president, he cannot turn a blind eye and a deaf ear to what's going on in the South. He tries his best. The guy's involved with Vietnam. He's now involved with the Civil Rights Movement, and he tries his best not to get too involved. But King and the marches are applying too much pressure. Governors, other individuals are really applying pressure to Johnson, and he has to act. Eventually, you have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that is passed. It makes segregation illegal in public places. Private employers had to end discrimination, and it creates the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. One of the ways that this act was able to be passed was the March on Washington. King was hoping for 20,000, 25,000 people to show up. He gets over 250,000 people to show up. And it puts a lot of pressure on Congress to get this passed. The longest filibuster in the history of the U.S. Senate occurred during this time. It was a filibuster that lasted over 56 days. But Strom Thurmond, senator from South Carolina, who's probably the most outspoken senator of all the senators when it came to the civil rights movement, spoke for just over 24 consecutive hours. And when a filibuster starts, the only way you start a filibuster is with cloture. In order to have cloture, you have to have it's a 3/5 vote. There wasn't a 3/5 majority to stop the filibuster. The 24th Amendment is passed. The 24th Amendment made poll taxes illegal. If you were going to go vote, you had to pay a tax. Well, voting takes place in November. Shortly after that time, after November comes December, and then you have Christmas. Well, if you're an African American and you go to pay the poll tax, you're not going to have enough money to buy Christmas gifts for your kids. And you couldn't pay for the tax in advance. This was a tax you had to pay when you went to the polls. And the whites knew that. That's why they established what they did. They used to have literacy tests. You would go to register to vote, and the clerk who would register you would ask you questions. And if you couldn't successfully answer the questions, then you were denied the opportunity to register. In the South, they tried anything and everything. Eventually, what's going to happen is, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, federal officials are going to be in courthouses throughout the South, and they are going to register African Americans to vote. The problem was whites would pay attention as to who would vote. Even though this is supposed to be totally anonymous, they could tell, they would stand out inside and say, okay, that person's voting, that person's voting. And the blacks knew this. And so there was intimidation. If you would go to vote that night, you might get a visit from the KKK. It might, if not that night, it might be the next night or sometime in the future. And so, just all kinds of different tactics that were used. So even though the Voting Rights Act of 1965 eliminated discriminatory practices like literacy tests, and the 24th Amendment made poll taxes illegal, blacks in the South were still afraid to vote. A lot of them really wanted to exercise their right to vote. But if you're dead, you can't vote. And that was literally a chance that you took. For some, they were willing to literally sacrifice their life so that they could have the opportunity to vote. Their kids could have the opportunity to vote. By 1965, two major goals of the civil rights movement had been accomplished, and that was segregation had been outlawed and voting rights were now protected. So now King is going to move on. He says, okay, got those first two out of the way. Now I'm going to move on to the next two. And the next two were poverty in the inner cities, poor housing, and also the big discrepancy in income. That you would have blacks and whites doing the same job, and the whites were getting paid much more. Problem is that as King is continuing to move towards his next two big objectives in the civil rights movement, his life is cut short on April 4th, 1968, when a bullet from an assassin's gun takes him out. King is in Memphis, Tennessee. He's there to help support the sanitation workers. He is staying at the Lorraine Hotel. He steps out onto the balcony, and an assassin. The assassin's name is James Earl Ray. James Earl Ray initially thinks he gets away with it. He's actually arrested at Heathrow Airport in London, and he's brought back to the United States. And he kind of gives a plea deal. He initially admits to killing King, and he's given life in prison. Later on, he said he was set up and he did not kill King. That's pretty much for the civil rights movement. I'd really like to go more in depth to the 1968 Olympics and talk about what happened there. But unfortunately, this video is long enough. So this concludes Unit 7.